There's a particular unease that comes with a locked door and silence on the other side. In cases like these, it's never about what's immediately visible. It's about what you can't see. When a woman is found dead in her own home, no forced entry, no sign of struggle, it leaves only one question: who did she trust enough to let inside? May 22nd, 2023, Schenectady, New York. At 7:13 a.m., dispatch received a call from a resident at 846 Crane Street. The neighbor hadn't seen Philomen Henry since the evening before. The hallway outside her apartment smelled off, something metallic, faint, but undeniable. Officers arrived minutes later, knocking twice, announcing themselves, pausing between each attempt. No response. The apartment's front door was secured from the inside. Through the mail slot, the flicker of a television screen cast shadows across the carpet. The decision to breach wasn't hard to make. Inside, the scene was contained. A small living room dimly lit by early daylight and the soft glow of the TV, which remained playing on low volume. On the floor, face down in a congealed pool of blood, lay Philomen Henry. 30 years old, multiple gunshot wounds clustered tight across her upper torso. Blood had pooled beneath her, dark and uneven along the hardwood. The body showed minimal outward trauma beyond the bullet wounds. No shell casings present, no signs of forced entry or extensive struggle. A single chair tipped onto its side suggested a quick confrontation. Detective Michael Raines arrived 35 minutes later. His assessment began with the facts. Victim located in the living room. Blood spatter analysis indicated a close-range shooting, 3 feet or less. The blood pattern, angled outward from the center of the room, confirmed the victim had been standing when the shots were fired. No defensive wounds visible at the time. No bruising or blunt force trauma, aside from impact injuries sustained from the fall. The absence of shell casings suggested a revolver, consistent with the wound patterns. Raines logged the details methodically. The apartment's front door had been locked from within. The windows remained latched. The living space showed no signs of forced entry, no pried locks, no disturbed furniture outside the tipped chair. The kitchen counter held a phone, still charging. A takeout container, untouched, sat beside it. The television, left running, filled the space with the distant murmur of morning news. Philomen Henry had not left that apartment willingly. The last text message sent from her phone went out at 10:49 p.m. the night before. "I'm home. I'll call you in the morning." It was routine, a message to a friend, but there was no call the next day. Instead, there was this. Her 2 children weren't present. Ages 7 and 9, they had stayed overnight with their grandmother, a detail that immediately reframed the scene. Whoever committed this crime knew the children wouldn't be there. That fact didn't come from luck. It came from planning. The forensic team expanded the sweep. Latent fingerprints found across the apartment matched the victim. No unidentified prints. No clear evidence of a struggle beyond the immediate area. Blood spatter analysis confirmed the victim was likely shot from the front, an execution-style confrontation. But the rest of the room remained undisturbed. It was calculated, precise. Victimology offered context. Philomen Henry, known in the neighborhood as Toy Toy, a single mother, operated a small catering business from home, specializing in Caribbean cuisine. Locals remembered her fondly, often describing the smell of spices drifting through the building's narrow hallways. But those same neighbors also reported the occasional raised voices behind her closed door, arguments, tension. None of them said they ever saw it escalate beyond words. But domestic disputes don't always leave visible marks. One name surfaced early: Bernard Alexander, long-term boyfriend, history with the victim, 2 prior arrests for domestic incidents involving Henry, one of which led to a protective order. Violated once, charges dropped when Henry declined to pursue. Patterns that spoke volumes. Alexander hadn't been seen that morning. His phone went unanswered. Raines reviewed the prior reports. 2 incidents logged over the last 18 months. Verbal disputes escalating into physical altercations, restraining order filed, withdrawn, the same cycle as countless other cases. Restraining orders aren't bulletproof, they're paperwork. Still, the detective held back. Patterns suggest motive. Evidence confirms it. And the evidence here? Too neat. The scene too contained. Nothing taken. No forced entry. No struggle. A targeted act in a space that was supposed to be safe. The coroner's preliminary assessment confirmed the cause of death. Multiple gunshot wounds to the chest. Close range. The shots fired in a tight cluster, likely from a .38 caliber revolver or similar weapon. No firearm recovered at the scene. The search for Bernard Alexander, now labeled as a person of interest, began immediately. But in the quiet of that apartment where the television hummed on and the day outside moved forward, the real question lingered. How does someone pull the trigger in a place like this and leave no trace behind? Sometimes the evidence aligns too cleanly, and that's the problem. The forensic sweep of Philomen Henry's apartment confirmed the basics. Multiple gunshot wounds fired at close range, no forced entry, no shell casings. But beyond the physical evidence left at the scene, the investigation had to establish context. The life of the victim, her habits, her relationships, her vulnerabilities, would shape the direction of what came next. Detective Michael Rains and his team turned to the victimology. This was more than background. It was essential. Every element of Philomen Henry's routine, every connection, every deviation from the norm could hold weight. The analysis began with the most immediate layers: her finances, her digital communications, and her known associates. Philomen Henry operated a home-based catering business. Transactions were largely cash-based, but recent bank records showed a pattern of irregular withdrawals, small amounts, often on weekends. A deeper review indicated that these transactions coincided with domestic incidents previously logged by law enforcement. On multiple occasions, funds were pulled in the days following police visits to her residence, not enough to raise suspicion in isolation, but enough to suggest financial control. The next layer was digital. Her phone, still plugged in at the crime scene, provided a window into the weeks leading up to her death. The last outgoing message, a routine check-in at 10:49 p.m., offered little, but the history revealed more. Over the prior month, there were multiple unsent drafts saved in her notes app, fragments of thoughts, unfinished messages. One draft read, "If I disappear, it wasn't an accident." Another, "I'm tired of being afraid in my own home." No intended recipient was listed. These weren't cries for help. They were evidence of sustained fear. Reviewing her call logs, a pattern emerged: regular evening calls with her mother, frequent messaging with close friends. But within the last week, communications had become sporadic. Gaps appeared where conversations used to be. When contacted, her friends confirmed that Philomen had seemed withdrawn. She made excuses for canceling meetups. One friend reported Philomen mentioning needing space but refusing to elaborate. A forensic download of her phone data surfaced a deleted message, partially recovered. The timestamp matched a known incident 2 months prior, when Alexander had been arrested for violating the restraining order. The content was brief. "He says it won't happen again. I'm just so tired." Investigators cross-referenced these findings with social services records. Philomen had filed for a temporary restraining order in March 2023. The report detailed prior physical assaults, controlling behaviors, threats. But within weeks, the order was lifted at her request. This isn't uncommon in domestic abuse cases, especially when children are involved. From a forensic standpoint, the data revealed clear behavioral patterns, cycles of abuse, followed by reconciliation, followed by silence. Her bank account was tied to joint transactions for basic utilities, but the majority of rent payments were made under her name alone. The apartment lease listed both her and Bernard Alexander, although neighbors rarely saw him during daylight hours. Next came the interviews. Neighbors provided consistent testimony, arguments behind closed doors, raised voices late at night. One neighbor reported hearing a loud dispute 2 nights before Philomen's death. Words weren't clear, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger, threats. After that night, things had gone quiet. Her mother provided more. She recounted the strained phone calls in recent weeks, how Philomen brushed off questions, how she reassured her that everything was fine. But in the last conversation, hours before the murder, she mentioned something unusual. "If anything happens, take care of the kids." Her mother pressed for details. Philomen deflected. The profile of Philomen Henry's final weeks took shape: isolation, financial irregularities, reduced communication, unspoken fears. The forensic record aligned with the behavioral data. Detective Rains noted these patterns, not because they were new, but because they were familiar. Too familiar. Alexander's financial records were pulled next. A separate analysis revealed minimal activity in the days following the murder. No significant withdrawals, no flagged transactions. But the absence of digital noise was itself revealing. Someone attempting to avoid detection knows to stay quiet. The last point in the victimology file was physical. The coroner's report, updated after a detailed examination, confirmed minor bruising on Philomen's right forearm, consistent with defensive wounds. Not enough to indicate a prolonged struggle. enough to show she raised her arms when the first shot was fired. The investigation at this stage pivoted from static data to active search. Bernard Alexander's name remained at the center, but the focus was evidence, establishing timelines, validating locations, cross-referencing movements. The next phase would test the gaps in his digital trail. But the weight of Philomen Henry's final weeks remained in the background, a pattern too common in domestic homicides. The signs were there. The warnings had been written, but never shared. By the time the crime scene was cleared and Philomen Henry's cause of death confirmed, Bernard Alexander's absence became the next critical point of focus. He wasn't at the apartment. He wasn't answering his phone. A welfare check at his last known address produced nothing. His vehicle was missing, no recent sightings. The search for Alexander transitioned from routine questioning to an active manhunt. The investigation pivoted to track his last verified movements. Surveillance from the apartment complex's parking lot offered limited visibility. The external cameras faced outward toward the street, leaving a blind spot near the building's rear exit. That gap gave investigators little to work with. However, adjacent businesses provided a partial lead. Footage from a convenience store across the block, time-stamped at 5:26 a.m., captured a dark sedan matching Alexander's registered vehicle driving eastbound. The plates weren't readable, but the make and model aligned. Investigators expanded their search radius. Automated license plate readers, ALPRs, positioned at major intersections, picked up a hit on Alexander's vehicle at 5:48 a.m., traveling south toward Interstate 88. From there, the digital trail cooled. No further camera hits, no electronic toll collection records. He avoided the main highways that might have tracked him further. With the physical trail limited, investigators turned to digital forensics. Alexander's cell phone records were pulled under warrant. His phone had last pinged near the apartment complex at 11:03 p.m. on the night of the murder. From that point forward, the device showed no activity, powered down or destroyed. A pattern emerged consistent with someone attempting to avoid detection. Investigators cross-checked financial records. Alexander had no active credit or debit transactions following the murder. His bank accounts remained untouched. However, a small prepaid debit card, rarely used, showed a fuel purchase at a gas station outside Albany at 6:11 a.m. The transaction was traced back to the same dark sedan captured earlier on surveillance. This purchase extended the geographic search window further south. Interviews with known associates revealed minimal useful information. Alexander maintained few close connections outside of Philomen Henry. Neighbors described him as quiet, kept to himself, never really around in the daytime. The lack of movement in his digital footprint suggested intent. People who run don't leave trails. Detective Raines noted these gaps. Too clean, too controlled. The silence wasn't incidental. It was designed. The next layer involved broader federal cooperation. U.S. Marshals were brought in to expand the search outside New York state lines. Cross-referencing missing persons, fugitive databases, and vehicle movement reports in neighboring states became routine. A partial breakthrough arrived when a witness in Scranton, Pennsylvania, reported seeing a vehicle matching Alexander's description parked behind a motel 2 days after the murder. The motel clerk confirmed a guest staying under a false name. The name didn't match any known aliases, but the timeline fit. The guest paid cash, stayed 2 nights, and left without notice. No security footage was available from the motel's parking lot. Cameras had been disabled due to maintenance, an unplanned gap that extended the search once again. The vehicle, however, was identified. Days later, local law enforcement recovered the sedan abandoned outside a transit station in Scranton. The vehicle was processed. Inside, forensic technicians found traces of gunshot residue on the steering wheel and driver's seat. The trunk was empty, but swabs revealed partial DNA consistent with Alexander's profile. With the vehicle recovered but Alexander still at large, the investigation shifted toward predictive profiling. Analysts reviewed known habits, prior travel patterns, and familial connections. Alexander's sister, living in New Jersey, was questioned but reported no contact. His known associates in upstate New York remained silent. Digital forensics attempted to uncover any burner phones or secondary communication lines. Tower dumps around the Scranton Transit Station identified several devices active within the time frame of the vehicle's abandonment. One device stood out, a prepaid phone purchased with cash at a retailer in Albany, activated the day before the murder. The device remained active for 48 hours post-crime before dropping off the network near Scranton. Though not definitively tied to Alexander, the timing and movement aligned with the established pattern. The case moved into its third week without a confirmed sighting. The media coverage remained limited to local outlets. Domestic violence homicides, while devastating, rarely draw prolonged national attention unless multiple victims or public spectacle are involved. But within law enforcement circles, the urgency held. An unstable fugitive with a history of violence, armed, mobile, unpredictable. By this stage, the investigation's focus wasn't just finding Alexander, it was preventing escalation. The next steps would rely on matching movement patterns, checking secondary addresses, expanding the net. There was no room for assumption. 3 weeks into the investigation, the forensic and digital trails surrounding Philomen Henry's murder had mapped a clear perimeter, a crime scene with no forced entry, a suspect who had vanished across state lines, and a vehicle abandoned but still rich with evidence. Yet for all that data, one piece remained incomplete: the body itself. The initial autopsy confirmed cause of death: 4 gunshot wounds to the chest, fired at close range. No additional trauma beyond a single defensive bruise on the right forearm. But the follow-up forensic pathology report, completed after detailed tissue analysis, revealed additional insights. The trajectory of the rounds indicated a downward angle on each shot. The shooter was standing, Philomen slightly lower, suggesting she may have been seated or kneeling when the attack began. Blood-pooling patterns confirmed she collapsed immediately after the first shot, with subsequent rounds fired in succession. There were no post-mortem injuries, no hesitation, no overkill. Toxicology results showed no presence of drugs or alcohol. Philomen was fully conscious at the time of her death. This eliminated the possibility of chemical restraint, a fact that aligned with the apartment's undisturbed state. She wasn't incapacitated. She let the shooter in, trusted them enough to sit down, and never had the chance to resist beyond raising her arm. Detective Rains reviewed the coroner's addendum alongside behavioral analysts. The lack of any physical struggle wasn't unusual in cases of domestic homicide where the perpetrator is known to the victim. But the precision of the shots, combined with the downward trajectory, indicated a level of control and intent that added weight to the prosecution's emerging narrative. The analysis moved to digital overlaps. Forensic technicians re-examined Philomen's phone data in conjunction with the recovered prepaid burner phone found in Scranton's tower dumps. While no direct link was established, timing patterns aligned. Both devices were last active within hours of each other, then went silent. The burner phone's last signal placed it 2 miles from the motel where Alexander was believed to have stayed. The metadata revealed no stored contacts, no messages, no call logs, consistent with an intentional burner used solely for evasion. Investigators expanded search warrants to include data retrieval from deleted files on Philomen's phone. A partially corrupted audio file was recovered, time-stamped 6 weeks before the murder. The audio was brief, 12 seconds. Philomen's voice, low but clear. "I know what you said, but I won't be afraid of you anymore." No further context. No reply audible in the clip. It wasn't enough to stand on its own in court, but reinforced behavioral profiling. Rains consulted with domestic violence experts to refine the suspect's psychological profile. The pattern repeated across similar cases: financial control, social isolation, escalation from verbal to physical abuse, withdrawal, and finally lethal force when the abuser perceived loss of control. What marked this case as distinct was the operational planning following the crime. Alexander's swift disappearance, use of cash, burner phone acquisition, and deliberate avoidance of digital footprints. It suggested not only a history of control but also premeditation. Further forensic review of Alexander's abandoned vehicle offered another layer. A closer examination of the interior fabric revealed trace fibers not consistent with the sedan's upholstery. These fibers matched a specific brand of commercial-grade bedding used in low-cost motels, consistent with the one in Scranton. The connection, while circumstantial, tied the suspect's known movements to the forensic evidence. Rains noted the precision of Alexander's choices. Each move, the burner phone, cash transactions, the decision to avoid toll roads, reflected a familiarity with law enforcement tracking methods. Yet mistakes still surfaced. The fibers, the residue in the car, the gaps in surveillance that, while significant, weren't absolute. The investigation's next phase involved pressure points, contacting associates again, revisiting Alexander's family connections in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and upstate New York. Investigators also began tracking bulk prepaid card purchases, narrowing down vendors and reviewing camera footage where feasible. While these leads developed, attention returned to Philomen's life outside the scope of abuse. Her financial records revealed a small loan applied for 2 months before the murder, intended to expand her catering business. It was denied due to insufficient credit, a result likely tied to joint financial management. The control extended beyond physical presence. It dictated her autonomy. One last element in the autopsy report warranted attention. The estimated time of death, between 11:30 p.m. and 12:30 a.m., narrowed the window further. Alexander's phone had shut down at 11:03 p.m. The gap between the phone's last ping and the probable time of death was slight but telling. He was still nearby, still planning. By the 4th week of the investigation, the forensic landscape had expanded across state lines. The suspect's vehicle had been located and processed, linking fibers, gunshot residue, and DNA. The burner phone aligned with his last known movements. Yet Bernard Alexander remained at large. His ability to avoid detection wasn't due to chance. It was deliberate, calculated. The fugitive tracking team shifted their focus to the missing gaps, those logistical blind spots that could conceal a person for weeks without triggering surveillance. The Scranton lead required re-examination. Initial sweeps of the transit station and the abandoned vehicle had centered on the obvious: vehicle forensics, burner phone metadata, motel records. But a secondary review of city surveillance logs identified a discrepancy. A pedestrian loosely matching Alexander's description appeared on a traffic camera 2 blocks from the transit station, time-stamped hours after the sedan was left behind. The image was grainy, the face turned, but the posture and build aligned with his profile. This placed him on foot, moving west away from major transportation hubs. The investigative team recalibrated. The initial assumption was that Alexander had used long-distance transit to leave the area, but the absence of credit transactions, Idaho usage, or further electronic signals indicated otherwise. The revised theory: he remained in proximity, relying on cash, potentially using informal networks or shelters. Local law enforcement expanded inquiries to include homeless shelters, day labor sites, and cash-based accommodations. One shelter employee recalled a man matching Alexander's general description arriving briefly, paying cash for temporary lodging, and leaving without formal registration. Surveillance coverage was absent at this site, reinforcing the pattern of calculated movement. Forensic strategy turned to monitoring these informal economies. Investigators mapped small businesses known for cash transactions: laundromats, convenience stores, day labor pickup zones. Field agents conducted unannounced sweeps, focusing on those within a 10-mile radius of Scranton's transit center. Simultaneously, the behavioral profile was updated. Alexander's past showed a history of control and manipulation, but limited social ties. He avoided large crowds and maintained predictable routines, patterns that now worked against him. This profile suggested he wouldn't venture far from familiar environments, likely relying on small, repetitive tasks for cash while avoiding identification. A break emerged from one of the laundromats. Surveillance footage captured a man matching Alexander's build, entering late at night, using a coin-operated machine. He wore different clothes from previous sightings, indicating he had access to some resources but remained isolated. The footage showed no interaction with others, no visible cell phone, and no engagement beyond completing his task and leaving. Agents canvassed the area, focusing on boarding houses and low-rent motels that offered weekly rates, often in cash. A motel clerk recognized the image. A guest using a false name had paid for a room 2 weeks earlier and stayed irregularly. When shown a photo of Alexander, the clerk hesitated, but confirmed a strong resemblance. No recent sightings, but the connection was solid enough to justify further action. Federal marshals coordinated with local officers to conduct targeted surveillance on these sites. Within 3 days, Alexander surfaced. He was observed entering the same laundromat at 10:47 p.m., following the same pattern: alone, no electronic devices visible, carrying a small duffel bag. When agents moved in, he offered no resistance. Upon arrest, Alexander refused to speak beyond basic identification. He declined legal counsel, stating only, "You have what you need." His fingerprints confirmed his identity, and he was extradited back to Schenectady within 72 hours. The duffel bag contained minimal belongings: cash, a second prepaid debit card unused, basic toiletries, and a second burner phone deactivated. Forensics processed the items, confirming no additional devices, no written plans, and no direct evidence linking the bag's contents to the crime itself. But the alignment of timelines, surveillance, and behavioral patterns closed the loop. The investigation shifted back to Schenectady, preparing for the legal phase. Forensic data would support the case: ballistics, trajectory analysis, DNA, digital movements. But for now, the immediate objective had been met. The fugitive was in custody. The perimeter tightened. With Bernard Alexander in custody, the investigation entered its next critical phase: the preparation for trial. The weight of evidence gathered over the preceding weeks needed to transition from investigative leads to admissible courtroom material. Forensic teams, legal counsel, and law enforcement coordinated to ensure each piece of the case met procedural standards, avoiding any risk of suppression or technical challenge. The initial bail hearing set the tone. Prosecutors presented the core evidence: Alexander's confirmed presence at the crime scene, the trajectory analysis from the autopsy report, DNA and gunshot residue found in his abandoned vehicle, and digital footprints that aligned with his evasion patterns. The court denied bail, citing flight risk and the severity of the charges: second-degree murder, with potential escalation to first-degree pending premeditation review. Focus then shifted to pretrial motions. The defense filed to exclude the burner phone data, arguing it lacked direct attribution to Alexander. Prosecutors countered with the timing, proximity, and behavioral consistency tied to the device. The court ruled in favor of admissibility, noting the alignment of the burner phone's activation and deactivation with the suspect's confirmed locations. This ruling secured one of the case's key circumstantial pillars. The forensic process continued with secondary analysis. Technicians re-examined the fibers found in Alexander's vehicle, comparing them to samples collected from multiple low-cost motels in Scranton and surrounding areas. The match to bedding material used in the motel where Alexander had stayed added another corroborative layer. Although not direct evidence of the crime itself, it reinforced his presence at critical points during his flight. In parallel, psychological evaluation reports were prepared. While Alexander declined formal interviews, his behavioral history, compiled through prior domestic disturbance reports and the timeline of the murder, shaped the prosecution's argument of control and escalation. Domestic violence experts consulted with the district attorney's office, providing testimony outlines on patterns of coercion, isolation, and eventual violence typical in abusive relationships. This framing supported the argument for premeditation without relying solely on physical evidence. The prosecution's forensic narrative remained focused. Ballistics analysis confirmed the caliber and trajectory alignment consistent with the revolver type. Though the weapon itself had not been recovered, the absence of shell casings, wound pattern, and close-range discharge supported the conclusion. Additional emphasis was placed on the defensive wound, Philomen Henry's attempt to raise her arm during the attack. This singular bruise served as physical testimony to the suddenness of the violence. Digital forensic experts reconstructed Alexander's movement patterns across the final 48 hours before and after the murder. While direct GPS data was unavailable due to device shutdowns, the alignment of surveillance footage, ALPR hits, and financial transactions created a cohesive timeline. The court allowed these sequencing elements, acknowledging their probative value in establishing intent and evasion. The defense strategy leaned heavily on reasonable doubt. With no weapon recovered and minimal direct eyewitness testimony, they positioned the case as circumstantial. Their pretrial motions sought to exclude domestic violence history, framing it as prejudicial. However, prosecutors successfully argued the relevance, citing its direct connection to motive, opportunity, and behavioral precedent. Further preparation involved jury selection strategy. Prosecutors focused on individuals with a clear understanding of domestic violence dynamics, ensuring the panel would not dismiss the psychological elements of the case. Mock trial exercises tested the strength of evidence presentation, refining the sequencing to maintain clarity and avoid cognitive overload. The approach remained procedural, layered, chronological, evidence-driven. The final pretrial step involved consolidating witness lists, friends and family of Philomen Henry. Law enforcement officers, forensic experts, and domestic violence specialists were scheduled. Each played a specific role, establishing Philomen's state of mind, confirming the forensic chain of custody, and contextualizing the patterns of abuse. The strategy emphasized corroboration across independent sources. With the legal framework established, the trial date was set. The case transitioned from investigation to adjudication, the culmination of methodical forensic work designed to translate evidence into accountability. The trial of Bernard Alexander began on a cold January morning in Schenectady County Court. The courtroom filled with procedural formality, the prosecution and defense aligning their strategies. This stage was not about uncovering new facts, but about presenting the evidence already established in a methodical, admissible manner. The facts were static. How they were interpreted would determine the outcome. The prosecution opened with a chronological framework, setting the timeline of Philomen Henry's final hours. They detailed the last communication from Henry, a text message at 10:49 p.m. confirming her safe return home, and the subsequent gap leading to her discovery. The presentation avoided conjecture, focusing instead on verified data: the time of death established through autopsy, the locked apartment door, the lack of forced entry. The first witness was the lead forensic pathologist. She recounted the autopsy findings, confirming 4 gunshot wounds delivered at close range. The angle of entry, consistent with a shooter standing above a seated or kneeling victim, reinforced the narrative of control. The pathologist explained the significance of the defensive wound, a contusion on Henry's forearm, detailing how it aligned with her raising her arm in reflex as the shots were fired. The prosecution tied this to the assertion of premeditation and dominance. Ballistics evidence followed. Though the firearm had not been recovered, the ammunition type, wound profiles, and absence of shell casings were consistent with a revolver. The forensic ballistics expert testified that while the caliber alone could not identify the specific weapon, the pattern of injury and the type of ammunition narrowed the possibilities. The digital forensic team presented the data sequencing of Alexander's known movements. They mapped the alignment of his phone's last signal near Henry's apartment at 11:03 p.m., the subsequent shutdown of the device, and the absence of activity for nearly 72 hours. ALPR data placed Alexander's vehicle moving south from Schenectady toward Pennsylvania early the next morning. Surveillance footage from businesses and the fuel transaction outside Albany further established the route. The defense challenged the digital evidence, emphasizing its circumstantial nature. No GPS tracking directly placed Alexander inside the apartment at the time of the murder. They framed the shutdown of his phone as speculative, lacking definitive proof of intent to evade detection. The prosecution responded by layering behavioral context. A domestic violence expert testified on coercive control patterns, financial manipulation, isolation tactics, emotional abuse cycles that mirrored Alexander's known history with Henry. The testimony avoided direct commentary on Alexander, focusing instead on general behavioral models. The expert explained how escalation to lethal violence often followed a period of increased resistance by the victim, supported by Henry's unsent text drafts and the recent attempt to secure financial independence through a small business loan. Witnesses from Henry's personal life testified next. Friends recounted the victim's increasing isolation, her withdrawal from social activities, and her final conversations expressing fear without naming specific threats. Henry's mother testified about their last phone call, where Henry asked her to care for the children if anything happened. The prosecution presented this not as a prediction, but as evidence of Henry's state of mind. Forensic technicians detailed the discovery and analysis of Alexander's vehicle, linking gunshot residue and fibers from the motel bedding in Scranton to his flight. The defense questioned the absence of direct forensic evidence. No murder weapon, no fingerprints at the crime scene beyond the victims. They underscored the gap between circumstantial alignment and absolute proof. The prosecution maintained its focus on pattern consistency. They emphasized the absence of alternative suspects, the behavioral sequence preceding the murder, and Alexander's evasion tactics. They presented the burner phone timeline, reinforcing its alignment with Alexander's movements, even though no direct communication records existed. As the trial progressed, the courtroom dynamics remained procedural. The defense relied on challenging the gaps in physical evidence. The prosecution anchored their case on the totality of circumstances, forensic data, behavioral patterns, and the sequence of events. The prosecution rested after consolidating these layers, setting the stage for closing arguments. The defense prepared to emphasize reasonable doubt, leaning on the absence of direct physical linkage between Alexander and the act of pulling the trigger. The trial did not hinge on dramatic confessions or new revelations. It was a contest of structure, whether the prosecution's layered approach, combining forensics, digital tracking, behavioral profiling, and witness testimony, formed a coherent whole beyond reasonable doubt. The prosecution and defense completed their closing arguments on the 11th day of the trial. Both sides adhered to structured presentations. The prosecution reinforced the alignment of forensic evidence, trajectory analysis, digital tracking, and behavioral profiling, while the defense pressed the absence of a recovered weapon and direct physical evidence connecting Bernard Alexander to the act of pulling the trigger. The jury received instructions to deliberate on the charge of second-degree murder, with the option to consider first-degree if premeditation was proven beyond reasonable doubt. Jury deliberations began at 10:12 a.m. The panel of 12 reviewed evidence in the order it was presented. They requested to revisit key testimonies: the forensic pathologist's report on the angle of gunshot wounds, the digital forensic mapping of Alexander's movements, and the domestic violence expert's profile outlining coercive control dynamics. Notably, they focused on the alignment between the timeline of Alexander's last confirmed presence near the victim's apartment and the projected time of death based on autopsy findings. By the afternoon of the second day, the jury reached a unanimous decision. At 4:37 p.m., the verdict was delivered, guilty of second-degree murder. The court clerk recorded the finding without incident. The defense's motion for an immediate appeal was noted but did not delay sentencing. The sentencing hearing followed 2 weeks later. Prosecutors submitted a pre-sentence memorandum outlining the severity of the crime, citing Alexander's flight from law enforcement, the sustained psychological abuse leading up to the homicide, and the forensic consistency indicating premeditated control. The defense offered mitigating factors, including Alexander's lack of prior felony convictions outside of domestic incidents and his cooperation upon arrest. The presiding judge reviewed the arguments, focusing on the escalation from documented nonviolent control behaviors to lethal force. The sentence was rendered 25 years to life in prison, eligible for parole after the minimum term. The judge cited the calculated nature of the crime and the subsequent evasion of law enforcement as aggravating factors. Forensic closure was achieved in procedural terms, but the impact extended beyond the courtroom. Law enforcement agencies conducted internal reviews of the handling of prior domestic incidents between Alexander and Henry. The review highlighted a pattern common in domestic violence cases, where early warning signs are recorded but rarely escalate to intervention without direct victim engagement. Community outreach programs in Schenectady cited the case as a reference point for improving victim support services, particularly regarding restraining order enforcement and early psychological assessments of coercive control cases. Law enforcement professionals participated in cross-training exercises with social services, focusing on identifying pre-lethal escalation patterns in abusive relationships. The forensic records were archived, ensuring the case remained part of training materials for both forensic pathologists and digital investigators. The sequencing of events, from digital tracking to behavioral profiling, served as a procedural case study for how overlapping evidence streams support a coherent legal argument. The Henry family declined public interviews following sentencing, maintaining privacy. Law enforcement officers involved in the case remained under procedural confidentiality, allowing the facts to stand without commentary. The system functioned within its design: a murder investigated, evidence gathered, a suspect apprehended, tried, and sentenced. Yet the broader discussion remained open: the intersection of domestic violence, control, and systemic response. The forensic and procedural elements delivered a verdict, but the human elements left questions on prevention and early intervention unresolved. Following the sentencing of Bernard Alexander, the case of Philomen Henry moved from courtroom proceedings into procedural closure. Yet for law enforcement, forensic specialists, and domestic violence advocates, the case offered points of reflection and areas for systemic review. The forensic components were clear: digital evidence, behavioral patterns, physical residue, but their intersection with human variables remained complex. The Schenectady County District Attorney's Office conducted a post-case evaluation, reviewing the timeline of events leading to Henry's death. Central to this review were the multiple domestic disturbance calls logged over the prior year, the restraining order filed and later withdrawn, and the documented patterns of coercion. While no procedural violations occurred during those earlier interventions, the pattern matched established pre-lethal escalation dynamics in domestic abuse cases. The district attorney's review emphasized interagency cooperation. Law enforcement procedures for tracking restraining order violations were revised, with increased emphasis on follow-ups and integration with social service agencies. Digital forensic practices were also updated, expanding how investigators sequence metadata from devices in cases of suspected domestic violence, even before criminal charges are filed. Training programs at the local and state levels incorporated elements from the Alexander case into curriculum updates. Law enforcement officers received additional instruction on recognizing coercive control indicators, not just physical violence. Forensic analysts studied the case's digital footprint layering, learning how overlapping data points, ALPRs, burner phone logs, financial transactions, could reinforce timelines even without direct witness accounts. Outside the procedural environment, domestic violence prevention organizations cited the case as a demonstration of systemic limitations. The Henry family's decision to maintain privacy left public commentary to advocacy groups, which pushed for enhanced funding toward victim support networks. These organizations highlighted the risks associated with the reliance on victim-initiated processes, such as restraining orders, which place the burden of enforcement on those most vulnerable. A procedural memorandum from the Schenectady Police Department summarized the forensic sequencing as a model of multi-layered investigation. The blending of physical evidence, trajectory analysis, gunshot residue, digital data, burner phone metadata, ALPR tracking, and behavioral profiling formed a framework for future cases. The memorandum emphasized that while no single piece of evidence conclusively established guilt, the combined weight of forensic data supported the legal argument beyond reasonable doubt. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's Behavioral Analysis Unit reviewed the Alexander case as part of its ongoing research into domestic homicide typologies. Their assessment aligned with prior findings that premeditated control behaviors escalate predictably, yet intervention strategies remain underdeveloped. The BAU's report suggested further research into integrating digital monitoring tools with traditional social service outreach to flag high-risk domestic scenarios. Within the forensic community, the Henry case underscored the importance of cross-disciplinary analysis. The integration of ballistics, pathology, digital forensics, and psychological profiling highlighted the need for cohesive data management systems. These systems allow multiple investigative strands to be reviewed simultaneously, minimizing procedural gaps that could otherwise delay or derail case progression. The legal outcome, 25 years to life, stood as a procedural endpoint. But the case's broader influence extended beyond punishment. It prompted updates to investigative procedures, enhanced community engagement with domestic violence prevention, and provided a structured case study for forensic science education. In the final procedural summary filed by the Schenectady County District Attorney's Office, the case of People v. Bernard Alexander was categorized as resolved. Yet the internal documentation closed with a statement reflective of the larger system. Forensic evidence can secure a conviction, but systemic gaps in prevention remain. The Henry case reinforced an enduring procedural reality. Investigation and prosecution follow after harm has occurred. Prevention remains outside the direct scope of forensic science, but remains a parallel priority for those tasked with ensuring cases like Philomen Henry's do not recur. In the end, this case wasn't just about forensic evidence or courtroom strategy. It was about a woman whose life was taken long before it should have been. If sharing this story serves any purpose, I hope it's this: never underestimate the warning signs. Speak up, ask questions, stay connected to those you care about. Sometimes the quietest struggles are the most dangerous. And now, I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on how we, as a community, can better recognize and respond to these situations before they turn tragic? Drop a comment below whether you've experienced something similar or just want to share where you're watching from. If this video resonated with you or gave you something to think about, hit that subscribe button so you won't miss the next story. And hey, if you didn't like this video, I still want to know why. Let's make these conversations stronger together. Let me know where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you.